So, you know the way upper class people are just plain better than the rest of us? I don't just mean richer or more privileged, but just better, ontologically, as human beings. Have you ever thought to yourself, this belief that I hold so dear about aristocrats being superior? I would love to read a story where that sentiment is expressed artlessly and cloyingly, with smugness and self-importance dripping from every page. Well, that's an oddly specific recommendation request, but you're in luck. Hello and welcome to The Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens. And today we're talking about A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. So yeah, this is going to be a bit of a rant. I don't really have anything good to say about this book, so I'm just going to say a lot of bad things about it. So if a book is just technically bad, in my opinion, the writing, the characters, etc., a lot of which is subjective, I think it's fair to criticize the book and explain why you didn't like it. But I don't think it's really worthwhile to go overboard with that criticism. However, when a book has a pernicious message, when the ideology being put forward in the book is morally repugnant, for example, I think it warrants strong criticism, especially if the book is popular and commercially successful. And the message of this book is, let's just say, in opposition to my values, my politics, my worldview. Like I said in my Welcome to the Channel video, I don't think ranting about a book's bad politics is necessarily a negative act. I think it can be a good way to reject values that are antithetical to your own and to affirm your own values. Now, some people may respond to criticism like this saying, oh, come on, man, it's not that deep, it's just a book, it's just a bit of fun, it's light entertainment, just enjoy the characters and the writing, it's not political. Well, firstly, I can't do that because the characters and the writing are not good. But more importantly, all art is political. Anyone who thinks they've written an apolitical book is mistaken. For example, any art that doesn't compel us to imagine something different from reality is implicitly supportive in some way of the status quo. You can certainly argue about the degree of that principle, but I don't think you can contest the truth of it. And besides, a book written about an aristocrat from the Russian Revolution all the way up through World War II and into Stalin, yeah, most definitely political. Alright, so now that I've defeated that straw man that I just constructed, let's get into a review of the book before we do the politics. So this novel is very superficial. If you scratch the surface of this book, you get more surface. I think the author hopes you'll be impressed by all the artifice and you won't notice the lack of substance. The trouble is that the artifice isn't very good either. The tone of the book is very smug and self-satisfied. It's twee and saccharine. It has this kind of dear reader style, which is very irritating. The narrator will sometimes stop the book to talk to the reader with kind of a "what's this?" record scratch when something happens. The word charming pops up in a lot of reviews of this book. Did we change the meaning of that word? In terms of the language and the writing, this book is overwritten. There's too much figurative language and lividly purple prose. Now, I like ornate descriptive prose, but it's one of those things that's very easy to get badly wrong. Here's one short line as an example. He felt an almost surprising sense of bliss. Almost is a classic bad writing word. So what is the author saying here? The character felt bliss. That feeling almost surprised him, but it didn't. It didn't surprise him. That's illuminating. The book has an astonishing overuse and misuse of ellipses. It has too many footnotes that aren't one of the two things that footnotes need to be to justify their inclusion, funny or interesting. Everything is affected and contrived to the nth degree. Now, I know these days in our postmodern cultural landscape, that kind of jaded, detached irony is everywhere. That can be a bit too meta or too nihilistic. But reading even a few pages of something this pompous and earnest and badly executed will have you begging for some empty cynicism. There are times when Towles goes for the Proust-Madeleine moment, starting with a sensory description of food, then trying to elevate the prose for emotional impact, and then maybe even stretch the sensation into a philosophical reflection or something like that. Now, there's no shame in not living up to one of the most celebrated passages in literature, but unfortunately these scenes are just really painful to read. Here's an example. So this scene is about three men eating stew and the Count's impressions of the stew. How to describe it? One first tastes the broth. The use of one is a bit affected. That simmered distillation of fish bones, fennel and tomatoes with their hearty suggestions of Provence. Okay. One then savours the tender flakes of haddock and the briny resilience of the mussels, which have been purchased on the docks from the fishermen. Kind of ran out of energy there at the end of that line. One marvels at the boldness of the oranges arriving from Spain. Marvels, that's a strong verb. And the absinthe poured in the taverns. And all of these various impressions are somehow collected, composed and brightened by the saffron, that essence of summer sun which, having been harvested in the hills of Greece and packed by mule to Athens, has been sailed across the Mediterranean in a felucca. Okay, we're just getting logistical now. In other words, yes, please use some other words. With the very first spoonful, one finds oneself transported to the port of Marseille, where the streets teem with sailors, thieves and Madonnas. That is definitely an aristocrat's view of a vibrant port city. The Count opened his eyes. Magnifique, he said. Going by the reviews, a lot of people like this kind of writing. I can only assume they've all been kicked in the head by a horse. Let's talk about the pretentious references that are littered throughout the novel. Did you know that Mr. Towles has read Tolstoy? You can tell because he named his main character Rostov, but you can also tell because he tells you over and over and over. There are passages where he will refer to Tolstoy or Homer or Tchaikovsky 4 or 5 times in the course of a page or two. I don't mind a few literary references in a book. I don't mind pretension in a book, but it is just too much. There's a scene where he talks about the taste of a wine clashing with a stew, and he goes into this classical analogy about Achilles and Hector, you know, bashing him over the head and dragging his corpse around the city of Troy and everything. It just goes on and on and on. Then he compares the soup and another wine more favourably to a snowed-in tavern and a gypsy tambourine. I am not making this up. You can hear the seams tearing in his metaphors as he stuffs the pages with this empty verbiage. It genuinely reads like parody. Some people are into things like wine or opera because they enjoy wine and opera. But for other people, these pursuits are class signifiers. The references in this book are signifiers. I've read this book. I know about this wine. If you have this esoteric knowledge as well, then chortle along with me, good sir. Nauseating. The metaphors and similes are too often overdrawn. One or two of them are okay, to be fair. We have one here. The window was only the size of a dinner invitation. That's a nicely figurative one that reinforces the life and the world that the Count had before the events of the book. But others are ludicrous. Her eyebrows were very much like the Marcato notification in music. That one just flows off the page, doesn't it? And some are just contextually ridiculous. With Andre a few paces behind him, the Count began walking the cellar's centre aisle, much as a commander and his lieutenant might walk through a field hospital in the aftermath of battle. See, I said lieutenant, the pretension is infectious. So yeah, in that scene they are talking about wine. The major crisis of this book involves wine bottle labels. Everything is over-explained to the reader. The Count will have an encounter and then we are told explicitly at length what he thinks about human nature or whatever based on that encounter, instead of letting the reader derive it from the interaction. The writing isn't evocative, it just tells you how to feel. The humour in the book, such as it is this awful, genteel, pantomime, comedy of manners dross. It reminded me of an even more insipid version of P.G. Wodehouse. Now personally, I don't like Wodehouse's humour, but at least he had the decency to present aristocrats as buffoons. This book has the tone and wit and subtlety of language of a story that you might have written in English class when you were about 10 or 11, which you finished with the words, "and then he woke up, the end." ? The novel is written as an exercise in showing off, but it falls flat because the author doesn't have much to show off. I found this comment in a review. It reads like what a Wall Street investment banker who had taken a great books class during his Ivy League days thinks literature should read like, which is exactly what this book is. Yep. In terms of the structure of the book, there are some oddities. Every chapter title begins with the letter A. Why? Because it's whimsical, of course. Don't you appreciate the whimsy? There's a Q&A on the author's website where he talks in a bit more detail about the structure of the book. As you may have noted, the book has a somewhat unusual structure. From the day of the Count's house arrest, the chapters advance by a doubling principle, and Towles has here misspelt the word principle on his website. He's spelt it like a school principal. Now, some people have issues with spelling, that's fine, but it's your official website, man. Get it checked by someone at least. Anyway, a doubling principle, 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, blah blah blah, up to 16 years. At this midpoint, a halving principle is initiated. 8 years until the Count's escape, 4 years, 2 years, etc., etc. Even in the structure of the novel, we see the author just trying too hard to be clever, and failing to be clever. In terms of the characters, I'm going to save the discussion of the book's main character for later when we discuss the politics, because he is the focal point of so much of the book's awful politics. For now, I'll just say that most of the other characters in the book are simply one-dimensional ciphers, and they exist simply to serve the Count, both narratively and literally. And then there are a number of underwritten women characters, and there's one character who dislikes the protagonist. But don't worry, he's presented as a dour oaf so that we know he's wrong. The plot, the story, there isn't really one. This book is just, hey, look at this great protagonist. There is kind of a trite resolution at the end which feels unearned and unsatisfying. Now, a book can take place in one location and it can work as kind of a slice of life piece of fiction. You can even have a book with very little progress or resolution and make it work if it's a commentary on existentialism or something like that. But this is not exactly waiting for Godot. This is more like waiting for this to end so I can go and do something else. So let's get into the politics of the novel. Firstly, let's talk about aristocracy and about class in general. What is a gentleman exactly? The word is used in two main ways. One is a romantic and typically presented as a female idea of a man who is gallant and chivalrous and respectful. And we won't get into the sexual politics of that term because that's not how it's being used here. I'll save that discussion for my other YouTube channel, The Politics of Friction. A gentleman, as Mr. Towles understands it, and as has been propagated for centuries in the kind of Western imperial core, is a man of good breeding who is superior to most other human beings. Not just a man who is in a position of power and privilege, but a man who ought to be there. The word gentleman is used to render a certain select group of human beings as more worthy than the rest of us. And it usually comes with a load of self-justifying bollocks about responsibility, you know, the white man's burden. So the purpose of a gentleman may sometimes be to rule or to oversee or to civilize some of the lesser beings of the world, or to have some sort of material power over people. But the activity of a gentleman in this book, as well as in a lot of Western literature, is a kind of refined leisure. The Count's purpose in life is to decide seating arrangements, to possess knowledge about wine, to identify ingredients using his cultivated palate, to explain the etiquette of being a gentleman to non-gentlemen. And everyone else's purpose is to serve him, to be of service to him. That's what the pores are for, after all. And it's in this idea of the elite patrician gentleman that we see the message of the book, which is that aristocracy is good and desirable and associated with traits like civility and culture, and also that it is rarefied and unattainable for most of us. For the rest of us, our lot in life is to serve and admire these noble beings, and to live out lesser lives. Because some people have blood running through their veins which makes them a better class of human, and they have a divine right to exist on a higher plane, materially, spiritually, culturally, socially, and ethically. And that message is despicable. It is the antithesis of humanism, and I utterly reject it. Ultimately, I have no interest in reading a Disneyfied, badly written defense of inherent aristocratic superiority. I say Disneyfied, but honestly, the Aristocats has a more nuanced take on class politics and power structures than this pablum, and it has some banging tunes. So when we look at the treatment of class in the novel, the focus is all on one aristocrat. All other class concerns are elided. They are deliberately obscured. We're talking about the Russian Revolution, probably the quintessential moment of class consciousness from history. All of the political and social upheaval, all the drama, all the stories that could have been told of workers and revolutionaries and soldiers, etc. And instead, this is what we get. The book occasionally tries to talk about class, but it does so in a ham-fisted and downright insulting way. For example, the Count mentions the Bolsheviks, but he only mentions them to complain about them dressing shabbily as an affectation. So the only way that we see class is through the eyes of the Count, who is not exactly an impartial observer. The way the Count describes people is firstly overwrought, like all the other writing in the book, but it also betrays his view of them. His descriptions of the waiters and barbers and the other working people are mechanical. Yes, he talks about some of them in glowing terms sometimes, but is he focused on their character, their personality, their humanity? No. You know what he talks about a lot? Their hands. These are manual beings. He talks about them being masters of their craft, but these are not really people to the Count. They are a class of servitors. It's an extremely patronizing view of working people, to put it mildly. And of course, they all love him. Why wouldn't they? The message of this novel seemed to me to be kind of an inversion of the message of that great Ishiguro novel, The Remains of the Day. That book slowly peels away the edifice of the idea of service as a virtue and shows us how a life of service is not in fact dignified or honorable. So let's talk a bit more about the Count. He is perfect. Literally. He's witty, he's erudite, he's unflappable, he's compassionate in a condescending way. He doesn't have any personality, he just has refined material tastes and knowledge, both of which are treated as moral virtues. The Count takes himself very seriously, and we are expected to do so too. The problem with setting up your main character as clever and witty is that if you as the author are not terribly clever and witty, it won't work. This doesn't work. Is there any character development? Does the Count learn anything from the women in his life, Nina and Sophia and Anna? Does he take anything from the working class staff? Does he confront his privilege? Does he grow as a person? No. Honestly, I think if you're impressed by the main character in this book, it says a lot about you as a person. I think there's a particular kind of dim-witted centrist dad type who thinks of himself as kind of a bon vivant character who would be very charmed by this guy. Let's talk about the perspective of privilege. A common complaint I saw in the reviews for this novel is that the setup is unrealistic. The idea of a stay in a luxury hotel as a punishment as opposed to the gulag or the wall, which may be more historically accurate, and a lot of other details like his meetings with Osip, the secret police guy, and the mingling of locals and tourists in the hotel and things like that. And I do have issue with some of the book's ahistorical content, which we'll get to later. But in terms of the starting point for the story, novels don't have to be realistic. This isn't historical fiction, it's a fairy tale. Although with all the footnotes and everything, it is kind of presented as historical fiction, which is disingenuous. But overall, I don't really have a problem with the setup of the book. A much bigger issue for me is why would I care? Why would I care about an effete, arrogant aristocrat living in a gilded cage, pining for erstwhile days of privilege and leisure, or at least more privilege and leisure, because he still has both in abundance. It's especially galling to read about all of his indulgences over the decades, given what we know other people were going through at this moment in history. And that's what's so insulting about this book. It romanticizes this privilege while refusing to engage with its origin or its material effects. How do aristocrats become aristocrats? How do they maintain their power and wealth and privilege? Murder, theft, slavery, immiseration, exploitation. You know, the kind of things that incite revolutions, like the one that's so studiously ignored in this book. Why would the Count's perspective resonate with me? What's worthwhile about it? Nothing. Is this supposed to be aspirational? Sadly, there are a lot of people in society who worship royalty, nobility, aristocracy. So if you're the kind of bootlicker who defends billionaires online, you might get off on this stuff. There are mentions of the Count's privilege that, again, read like parody. He recounts being locked in the wine cellar of the Rothschild family with the Baroness. He talks about how he knew the prince. This guy is just so relatable. The Count says that he finds political discourse tedious. Well, he would, wouldn't he? That is his privilege. Why would he need to partake in politics, which is the mechanism for change? Any change for men like him is bad, hence his current situation. He has this glib remark at one stage that his philosophy is based on the weather, not on religion or science or morality or humanity or anything like that. I suppose weather is the only thing that has ever fluctuated in his life of privilege. Many people will often claim that they are apolitical, that they are above politics. Nobody is above politics. Actually, the people who say this are always heavily invested in the status quo, because that's what affords them the privilege to nominally ignore politics. There is nothing more ideological than claiming to be above ideology. The Count's feigned indifference to politics is, like much of this book, entirely unconvincing. Let's talk about shaping a narrative and how the novel skews and manipulates history. This is one of the most American books that I have ever read, and unfortunately, in this particular context, I mean that pejoratively. Sorry, Yanks. The Brits are going to get it worse in a minute, don't worry. The author has said openly that he didn't do much research for the book, and it shows. The novel is brazenly ahistorical. But then, more insidiously, it presents itself as this sanitized fairy tale version of history, willfully occluding the reality of the period. And it's in this obfuscation that it reveals itself to be a very reactionary and counter-revolutionary piece of work. Let's talk about errors for a minute. The author overreaches at times in this book and is quite sloppy with some of the details. His French, for example. He uses the plural of tableau instead of the singular. He has Rostov say de rien. An aristocrat would never say de rien, he would say je vous en prie. Now, generally, I'm not into that kind of cinema sins style of picking at art for tiny little mistakes. I don't think it's productive. These particular errors are not a big deal, although it must be said that they do chip away at the supposed erudition of the Count and the author. But if we look at some of the other errors in the book, using Fahrenheit for temperature, using pounds for weight, and it's a little unclear in the book, but he seems to have Russians celebrating Christmas in December. These errors don't betray carelessness, but rather a kind of chauvinistic, willful ignorance that, again, is very American. Looking at the narrative as a whole, there is no credible Soviet or Russian point of view presented to us. It reads like it was written by an American, which it was. What we get is a purposely westernized portrayal of Russia and of Russians. This phenomenon is very common among former colonies. Think about places like Egypt or India or even Ireland, and how the history and culture and people of those places are reduced to broad stereotypes and reductive, exoticized iconography. The true history of the place is excised, and a new one is invented and propagated. Ultimately, this process aims to justify whatever colonialism or imperialism took place by painting the natives as primitives who needed to be civilized, and any unrest or dissent is taken out of the narrative. In the consciousness of the Westerner, this place is made to be seen as an other, as a lesser entity. Now, obviously, the geopolitical history between the West and Russia is quite different, but this Orientalist approach to depicting the country is roughly the same. This book is not a description of Russia, it is an ascription. This novel adds to the mountain of soft propaganda regarding Russia or the Soviet Union, and it helps to shape that narrative. Some people in the West may go out of their way to study Russian history or read Russian literature, but for most people, all they consume is the Western narrative of that place. If you ask the average Westerner about the Soviet Union or socialism or something like that, even if they don't know much about it, they'll often have a very critical and a very emotional response. That's the result of propaganda, and this book is part of that cumulative propaganda effort. A Gentleman in Moscow is fluff, yes, but don't mistake that for an absence of ideology. That's the camouflage for the ideology, and it is effective. A lot of people will reject out of hand the notion that light entertainment can be politically malignant, whether it's a light novel like this or a TV show about cops or whatever. And that's what makes these works so powerful in their ability to disseminate a particular ideology. This kind of thing has enormous material effects. Along with news media, culture is one of the major forces that shapes the way we see the world, the way we see certain people, the way we see certain concepts. Edward Said, for example, has written brilliantly about this. Nobility, aristocracy, monarchy, obscene wealth, colonialism, all of these things are legitimized and laundered through culture. Think of the popularity of cultural touchstones like The Crown, Downton Abbey, Mr. Darcy, Disney princesses. Even stuff like Bridgerton and Hamilton, which put a progressive veneer on history. But instead of imagining actual systemic change brought about by, say, revolution, it's just, hey, what if history but no bad stuff, which is juvenile. If you want to examine the material effects of this kind of cultural output, just look at the UK and look at all the forelock tuggers and sycophants that you have in that country, enthralled to a family of inbred parasites who rule over them, steal from them, and presumably laugh at them quite a bit. You've got the British media and a sizable portion of the population, going by polls, who fawn over, for example, the coronation of a king, a hereditary monarch, in the 21st century. Look at the reaction to the death of the Queen. All that performative grief and all these people who believed she was just a kindly old woman who never did any harm to anyone. That's the effect of narrative shaping. That's the power of propaganda. In many ways, the function of the state under capitalism is to maintain the position of the ruling classes. The function of a lot of mainstream culture is to normalize that process to the point where you don't realize it's happening. So look, if you enjoyed the story and the writing and the characters in this book, that's your experience and your opinion. I can disagree, but I can't take that away from you or tell you that you're wrong. If you recognized the bad politics and enjoyed the book in spite of them, all good. I do the same thing all the time, whether it's with an 80s action movie or whatever. If we could only consume things with perfect politics, we would not have a lot of things to read or watch. But the issue for our society, I think, is all the people who will read something like this and they won't even notice the politics. They don't see the ideology. That is something that needs to change, but don't ask me how. Okay, that's it for today's video. The rant is over. Thanks for sticking with it. I hope you enjoyed that affirmation of my own values. If you want to take a second to give the video a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, that would be great. You can also check out my Patreon, where there have been 2 videos posted already, Mark Twain and Mary Shelley. So check that out if you'd like a lot more content. Okay, that's it for today. Look after yourselves, look after each other. See you next time. Good luck.